Let's talk about some cards I'd like to buff from Saviors of Uldum.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
That's right, about a year ago, we saw the Rise of the Mech event buffing cards from Boomsday Project, and I'm revisiting some of the expansions from last year to see which cards I changed there that I think could have positive impacts on the meta. So this video is sponsored by Keeps, which we'll talk about a little later. But for now, let's jump into the 7 cards from Saviors of Uldum that I would buff. So first up here is Hack the System, the Warrior Quest, which is a card that really hasn't seen a lot of play. There've been a few fringe lists out there, like tier 3, tier 4 stuff, that tried to get this card to work, but mostly it's fallen out of the meta and never really seen any relevance. But I think one small tweak to this hero power, the reward for Hack the System, would make all the difference. That's giving the golems that are summoned Taunt. Right now, you can summon a lot of 4/3 golems, but often your opponent can just kind of ignore them and hit you in the face and kill you. But by giving the golems Taunt, basically you force your opponent to interact with this board, and the payoff becomes far more substantial. Beyond that, as a warrior who's attacking a lot, you're probably hitting minions, you've probably taken a lot of damage along the way. This gives you that little bit of extra defensive utility. And the payoff turn for Hack the System, if you can get 3 or 4 big golems, suddenly makes a lot of sense. Whereas before, it would be hard to really realize the potential of this card immediately, because it'd take another turn after summoning the golems for them to finally attack and start influencing the board. So it played way more like this kind of infinite value card of sorts, as opposed to a big tempo swing card. Giving them Taunt, perhaps Rush would be another alternative, although maybe too good as far as I'm concerned, would be a way to put the tempo into play for these golems much, much faster. It would make Hack the System, I think, a pretty relevant meta card with a big payoff. So moving on here to Whirl Kick Master, a card you probably forgot existed. We've tried to make this thing work a few times, and it's just miserable. The problem is, right, combo cards can be pretty expensive, and it's hard to create a chain of combo cards that consistently go off. Unlike something like Shadow Jeweler Hanar, where you have predictable mana costs and often 1 mana secrets from Paladin as well, you can create these really long chains and you can kind of guarantee what you're going to do next. With Whirl Kick Master as it exists today, you're just tossing it in there. I'm going to get some random combo card. It may cost too much. I can't really do anything consistent or predictable here. But instead of getting a random combo card, if you were able to discover the combo card, much like with Shadow Jeweler Hanar, then you'd suddenly have a couple things you could do right. You could specifically play towards one sort of thing, like finding additional damage outputs, which might be nice in a late game. You could try to find more value-oriented combo cards. You could try to create immediate chains, or just try to find some specific thing that you're looking for, like that big Edwin. So this just gives you a lot more control and influence over how the second or third or fourth combo card of this is played. It doesn't guarantee anything, of course, because there's enough out there combo card-wise that you're not getting a set amount of things always, but it would just increase the consistency a little bit, pull it closer to that Shadow Jeweler Hanar world. And frankly, combo is a mechanic in Rogue that exists. Certainly, it's always kind of around with Edwin, but it's never been necessarily a key component of the identity of the class. It's there, but it's never been like the target of a deck or something you built around. I think having it be a focal point would be pretty cool, and this version of Whirl Kick Master could indeed do that. So next up here, let's take a look at Conjured Mirage. And for this one, it's a really simple change. I would just move it from 4 mana to 3 mana. I already love the design of Conjured Mirage. I wouldn't want to tweak this one too much. It's this cool, like, stall defensive card, almost like a Doomsayer, but one that doesn't really work quite as well or quite the same. But it also shuffles back into your deck, so it's got this, like, fatigue protection aspect. A lot of cool elements to this card that I'd love to see played, but at 4 mana, it's just too expensive. Your opponent can kind of chill and not actually trade into the Conjured Mirage, and you didn't really accomplish anything with your 4 mana that you spent. It's harder to squeeze other things into your turn around it, but at 3 mana, suddenly it's far more flexible. It comes down earlier in the game, where it's more likely to make an impact and slow things down. If your opponent does decide to trade into it and finally kill it off, they can't do it as easily. And of course, if they don't kill it, which is the most likely outcome, when you reshuffle it and get it back, it's going to be cheap. You can make other big plays alongside your Conjured Mirage, just increasing in flexibility and using it as a repetitive stall that's much, much more exciting to draw and far more reasonable to play. So next up here is Shadow of Death, and this is a pretty big change, and in some ways you might even say it's not necessarily a buff, but I think it would be a far more playable card, because right now Shadow of Death is basically relegated to kind of meme decks, silly, ridiculous combos. It hasn't been something that's really made it into a competitive deck list. It's certainly a fun card right now, but I thought in particular the flavor of this one felt a little off to me. Shadow of Death implies that the thing died. But when you cast Shadow of Death on something right now, it doesn't actually die. You just pick the minion and it still lives there on board. I thought it would feel far more flavorful if it actually killed a minion. So what if it was an assassinate with this same effect applied to it? And that made way more sense to me. So instead, it's a 6 mana destroy a minion removal tool for a single target removal in the vein of Assassinate, even something like your Vilespine Slayer of old. And I think that's really cool because if you destroy a really high value minion of your opponents, you're going to potentially draw those later and create some big swing turns later in the game. So yes, it's more expensive than Assassinate, of course, but there's also this long-term upside where you could draw 3 Tyrians, 3 big crazy 8/8s, whatever you might want. The Shadow of Death can provide that as long as you're willing to spend a little bit more premium for mana. Now, this does reduce the meme potential of Shadow of Death because you wouldn't want to use this on your own minions as much. You might still, in many cases, with Death Rattle synergy things, or you might just be willing to destroy something really sneaky anyway. So there's still a little bit of meme potential, but that's lost to some extent, I admit, in order to make this card more interesting in a kind of defensive or normal competitive Hearthstone perspective. Now, I still don't know if this card would be good enough. 6 mana is quite a bit to spend on hard removal these days. It's kind of like a Flick alternative, but Flick's way better in many ways. So possible play, possible buff, debatable at that. But I think just a more flavorful change to the card that I would personally prefer, even if it's not necessarily better. But let me know what you think about this one. So next up here is Rift Cleaver, a minion I think was pretty hyped when it got revealed. People thought it was going to be a great mid-game removal swing sort of card, but it turned out the punish here for taking a lot of damage was just way too much compared to the upside. But I think one small tweak could help this card a little. I don't know that it would be quite enough to make this card good, but for me, it's actually still more flavorful anyway, and that's making it take damage based on attack instead of health. So right now, if you kill a 4/12 Malagos with your Rift Cleaver, your face is going to take 12 damage, and that's a lot. With this other new version of Rift Cleaver, though, you'd only take 4, which might make it far more palatable. So, of course, in some cases, if it's symmetrical minions, you don't gain anything at all. But there are a lot of high target things to kill that have much, much higher health. Think about, like, the 4/9 Skeletal Dragon for Priest. That's much, much better to kill with this version of Rift Cleaver. Now, again, it might still be too much damage to take. Warlock has access to a lot of different removal, a lot of things they can play instead of this, but for me, it's also just more flavorful because if you're killing something, right, it's going to basically lash out as its final blow and try to get one last attack off, and that's the damage you take based on its attack. I'm not sure exactly why you take damage based on its health. Maybe there's something there. It's like destroying the soul, and the soul is encapsulated by the health. But for me, attack feels like it fits the storyline of a card like this better. Plus, I think it would just make it, in many cases, stronger. Of course, it would be worse at removing, like, higher attack minions. Something like an 8/4 would be terrible for this new version of Rift Cleaver. But those are very uncommon to see in the meta. We usually have symmetrical or health higher minions as opposed to attack higher minions. So I think 90% of the time, maybe even 95% of the time, this one's much, much better. And although maybe still not playable, it's at least a possibility. All right, before we get to the last card, let's talk about our sponsor for this video. It's Keeps, who can't buff cards, but they might be able to buff your hair. If you didn't know, 2 out of 3 guys will experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time they're 35. I just had my birthday. I'm getting pretty close to that target. But the good news with Keeps is you don't have to go to your doctor for any sort of prescription hair loss treatment, which means in these trying times, you can get medication delivered right to you while sitting all comfy and cozy at home. If you're not quite sure how all this works, or if you're still skeptical, please check out Keeps' countless 5-star reviews and know that more than 100,000 fellow dudes have already used Keeps. So if you're noticing that you're losing your hair, you can do something about it. For a limited time, go to keeps.com/Regis or click the link down there in the description to receive 50% off your first order. Yeah, so finally, let's take a look here at Ascendant Scroll, the hero power for Raid the Sky Temple, a card I famously gave a 5-star rating to and has basically seen 0 play in competitive decks, like maybe one fringe deck here or there. Now, when I did that, my thought was, hey, look, you can make all these infinite resources. At the time, the Dr. Boom hero card was dominating the meta because of its ability to make a lot of resources in many cases. on top of having tons of rushing mechs, but you get the idea. So I thought, man, infinite resources are great. But of course, as it turns out, random mage spells in general aren't that good. There's a lot of really low cost ones that just don't do enough, or just a lot of really bad random spells too that just don't mean anything at all. Think Glacial Mysteries, of course, in wild format right now for a perfect example. So the hero power just didn't really offer infinite value because half the time it didn't really do much at all. It just kind of filled your hand with garbage cards that were useless. You know, I can remember getting like a ton of Ancient Mysteries with no secrets in my deck, for instance. You just have a bunch of 0-mana Ancient Mysteries, which are really hard to utilize. So this one fell pretty far short, but if you watched closely, Blizzard teased the notion that in the past it allowed you to discover a mage spell instead of getting a random one, which certainly helps to increase the consistency of the hero power. So you can pick really good spells. Now, if it also gave a discount and discover, I think that would be too strong. But if you take away the discount, so it no longer says it costs 2 less, but you keep the discover aspect, then essentially you've got that infinite value hero power without the kind of additional tempo gain from the discount, where the hero power becomes essentially free. So it becomes this really grindy value card like I imagined. We saw with Delivery Drone for the Dr. Boom hero card, it didn't need a discount, just needed the resources. I think this version of Ascendant Scroll, where it's just discovering you a mage spell, is enough. Like, that could still give it that game plan where it goes super long. You're going to often get a couple weak spells, but one thing that's pretty good, that random rolling fireball, occasionally the deep freeze or the power of creation, some kind of awesome card that makes it feel worth it. And in particular, Mage has a lot of good 8-mana cards right now, which would line up very nicely with the 2-mana hero power. If you wanted that Yogg's Puzzle Box, though, you'd have to wait to play it for a future turn, which can help keep things like this in check. The same for Pyroblast. You can't dig for those answers for immediacy because you don't have that spare mana. And I think that's important. I think if it still gave the discount and discovered, this would be completely OP. It would be so strong. It would be bonkers Primordial Glyph every single turn, and that would be too much. I think this finds a nice middle ground where you increase the consistency, you retain that long-term value, but you don't create just absurd turns every single turn. So this is how I would change Ascendant Scroll to make it the card I sort of envisioned it being all along, this great value generator, and would make the Mage Quest, I think, a relevant piece of the meta, particularly in something like a Highlander Mage. You got some competition now with Amazing Reno, but this could, in fact, be good enough to push him out to retain this really powerful long-term value-generating hero power. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for these cards that I buff. I know in many cases it's kind of like a sideways buff or a small tweak to make them feel more flavorful or feel a little better. But that's important too. Just changing cards can have small impacts that, snowball into really big changes in the meta. So a few of these were probably significant buffs that would get these cards played. A handful of others were just make them feel better, which is important to me as somebody who likes playing with underutilized cards. If you think I need to take things further, let me know in the comments below. If there's other cards you'd like to see changed, you think it would make them feel better, make them help the meta in some way, certainly share those thoughts in the comments as well. This is obviously an incredibly subjective exercise, and we'll have no reflection of reality. I don't even expect us to get any sort of card buffs this time around, but I think it'd be fun to change some of these, update it, and give us opportunities to experiment with these cards in a new way and perhaps at a new power level. So that said, thanks much as always for watching, and until next time, game on.